Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you stand, and welcome to our web conference. I'm Isabelle Facon, a Deputy Director of the Fondation for Strategic Research, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to discuss Russia, the challenges it is posing, and its impact on transatlantic relations, especially because in this community of transatlantic relations, we don't see eye to eye on Russia all the time. So it's interesting to discuss that. I guess the timing is quite appropriate, I should say, unfortunately, because we have this situation at the Russian-Ukrainian border. Michael, I saw that you tweeted just a couple of hours ago that more troops from Russia's 41st Army were moving to the Western Military District. We have these demands on the part of Russia to the West, NATO, on security architecture in Europe. The situation with Belarus, the Assad test a few days ago. So Russia gives us obviously a lot of work to do, of deciphering work. What Russia is up to is a good question. And maybe Antony Blinken, who has just met his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, a few hours ago, knows now better than we do. I can see that we have many people online. They are here to listen, not me, but our three speakers. Thank you very much to the three of you to participate in this discussion. We will have already today Olga Oliker, who is the director of the Europe and Central Asia program at the International Crisis Group. Michael Kofman, who is a research program director at the Center for Naval Analyses. And to discuss Olga's and Mike's presentations, we will have Samuel Charap, a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. So welcome and thank you to the three of you. And before we get started, I would like to thank the U.S. Embassy in Paris for supporting this event. As I said a few minutes ago, it's the second in a series of web seminars. So thank you very much. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Liam Wasley, Acting Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy, for a few opening remarks. Thank you. Okay. Liam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. The U.S. Embassy in Paris and our consulates in France are pleased to support today's conversation. We're pleased to partner with FRS on this series exploring American and French perspectives on some of the challenges we're facing globally. I can't think of a better day to talk about Russia. We couldn't have planned this session for a more timely day if we had wanted to. But yesterday, NATO foreign ministers met in Riga, and Russia and the threats it posed to Ukraine were the top topics. The Allied ministers made a strong display of unity and resolve to confront Russian efforts to destabilize the government of Ukraine and to threaten its borders. The demonstrations of unity follow strong statements from our leaders, from President Macron's call to President Putin 2 weeks ago, to President Biden and President Putin's virtual meeting shortly thereafter that warned of serious consequences of Russian aggressive actions. And of course, Putin has responded with his own red lines and threats. But Ukraine's just the most immediate part of the geopolitical challenge we're facing, from Belarus's efforts to weaponize migration as a tool on its neighbors and against the European Union, to French cyber infiltration of Western digital systems through solar winds, to increased Russian adventurism in Africa, and the most recent reckless use of an anti-satellite missile that endangered all of our activities in space. But with Siberia, it's one of the regions most affected by climate change, the changing dynamics of international terrorism. Russia is also an essential partner. In less than a month, France will take the helm of the EU, so we'll be in a pivotal position to manage immediate threats, energy, migration, Europe's borders, while also playing a key role in shaping the strategic compass and NATO's new strategic concept, which will guide those institutions for years to come. So we've got a lot to talk about today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. On the US side, as President Biden said in Geneva in June, the US and Russia have a shared responsibility for the responsible management of the relationship between our two countries. We cooperate where there's mutual interest and where there's differences, and there are many. It's important to have a frank and direct dialogue. To that end, we launched our Strategic Stability Dialogue, and that process continues. We've also doubled down on our relationship with France. During recent meetings between President Macron and President Biden and Vice President Harris's recent trip to Paris, we underscored the vital nature of our partnership with France. And the US recommitted to deepening our coordination and cooperation across a whole range of global challenges. So as we navigate the dangerous days ahead, the strength of the Franco-American partnership and the transatlantic relationship will be key to our success. So I'm really looking forward to hearing today's conversation and hearing the rich perspectives from both sides of the Atlantic as we embark on this important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liam. So we're not going to wait before launching the discussion, and I will immediately leave the floor to Olga Oliker. Olga, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Isabelle. Thank you, Liam. Thank you to the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique and to the US mission. So the way we build this was to divide it up where I would talk about the politics and Mike would talk about the military tools and challenges, tools Russia uses, challenges Russia poses. It's not always a clean dividing line. And I think in our narratives, it often seems that it's easy enough to say, as Karl von Clausewitz did, that war is an extension of politics by other means. Sometimes in the narratives, it seems that it's the opposite, that we're all constantly in a state of war, and politics is just one of the ways by which it is fought. And certainly when we talk about the weaponization of energy, migrants, economics, snack food, information, that's what it sounds like. I do think there's a difference between military and political, and I think it's really worth parsing this, if for no other reason than if everything is war, then the responses to everything need and can be militarized, which I think does more harm than good. So I like to think about it as tools of national power, and kind of parse which tools of national power a country might use and what kinds of effects they might have. When they start killing people and breaking things, then I start thinking that it feels military. Up until then, when it's making people rethink things, even if it's coercive, even if it's unpleasant, I tend to think it's politics. But before you can talk about the tools and the challenges, it's helpful to ask the question, okay, Russia. It's clearly, we pose it in this discussion as a problem, as a challenge. A lot of the conversations we have here in Europe, that folks have in the United States about it, it's the Russia problem, the Russia challenge. Why is Russia such a challenge? Why is Russia's view of the world, and specifically of Europe and the Euro-Atlantic space, so different from ours that we're consistently clashing? And I think, the answer to that is not simply that the Russians are evil and bad and out to get us all, right? They don't think they're evil. They're coming at this from a perspective of trying to guarantee their own interests and their own security. So what are those? I'm going to postulate a few, and Mike and Sam may or may not agree with me. Folks in the audience may or may not agree with me as well. But what I would argue is that a few things are going on. One is that Russia does feel almost perennially insecure, and you can use neorealist international relations theory to explain that. You can use constructivist international relations theory to explain that. You can use a blend of the two and call it persistent factors in Russian security, where you point to its borders, you point to its size, you point to the weather, and all of these get you to the place where, if you look through Russian history, Russia has a very strong tendency to feel insecure, to want buffers around itself, to feel that the countries nearby, particularly those in Europe, are out to get it. You also have the more recent history of the collapse of the Soviet Union, after which the NATO, and which Russia views as a U.S.-led a U.S.-led alliance, which it is, basically started to, from Russia's perspective, make inroads, right? So if Russia is the main successor state to the Soviet Union loses its allies in the Warsaw Pact because the Warsaw Pact falls apart. Those countries go off and join NATO. The Soviet Union itself has fallen apart too, into its constituent parts. Several of those have gone off to join NATO, and others NATO has more and more of a relationship with. So I used to refer to it as it's the sense that the Soviet Union dropped a bag of candy and then turned into Russia, and kind of looked around and saw the United States and NATO picking up all that candy, and instead of giving it back, they're eating it, which is not a narrative that gives an awful lot of agency to these countries. It views them as as candy, right? As something that somebody gets. And that's not fair, and that, there are good reasons that these countries wanted stronger relationships with NATO, with the United States. And a lot of those reasons had to do with the fact that they saw Russia as threatening. But this narrative, this view of the world, continues to shape how Russia looks at things. It also does not help that it looks at NATO narratives, US narratives, Western narratives about Russia, and talk of illegitimate governments, talk of elections that aren't free and fair, combines that with US NATO actions to actually overthrow governments in other countries, and thinks, if this can happen there, it can happen here. What does Russia want then in the Euro-Atlantic space and beyond? It wants a sphere of influence in its neighborhood. It wants those buffers. It wants the confidence that the countries around it are friendly. It doesn't want the countries around it to be part of it, because if they're part of it, they're not buffers anymore. It wants client states. It wants a seat at all of the great power tables as the constellation of great power shifts and redevelops. It wants to be one of the countries making these decisions. To what ends, you ask? Well, that depends. Unclear yet. The situation might evolve in all sorts of ways. Russia wants to make sure it's at the table because its other concern, and this comes from this sense of insecurity, is that it's to make it difficult for other people to make things hard for Russia. Russia wants to be one of the states that's making the rules, that's enforcing the rules. It does not want to be one of the states that's bound and limited by the rules in a way that could hurt its security. What does that translate into in Europe? Well, it translates into this conflict, this constant contestation of influence over former Soviet countries. To a lesser extent, countries in the Western Balkans that were not former Soviet, but that were part of Yugoslavia once upon a time. It translates into, interestingly, a lot of frustration with the EU as such, and a preference for working one-on-one with individual member states, in part because Russia feels it has more leverage that way, and it's a more effective way for it to work. It translates into a certain amount of saber-rattling and coercive messaging to countries in Europe, both the ones that are within the NATO alliance and the European Union and the ones without, because Russia comes back to, when it looks at what its assets are and how it can be most influential and have the most leverage, threats tend to be what it falls back on. So you get a lot of this coercive messaging. But it's not just coercive messaging. It's not just threats of military power, which Mike will talk about. It is other things. There are other tools. Energy and trade is one of the ones that people will point to quite often, and historically have pointed to. Russia sells a lot of gas. Europe uses a lot of Russian gas. Russia has spent a lot of time over the years trying to transform that into a tool of influence. Its success has actually been limited. It can make a mess sometimes when it's doing it, but in terms of actually translating into influence, less effective. So for instance, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova. used to get a vast quantity of their energy very, very cheap from Russia, kind of an artifact of the Soviet Union. As time went on, Russia started to raise their gas prices. They started not to have difficulty paying. You'd get these fights back and forth. But the thing is, they were also on the path of their gas deliveries to Western European states who did pay for their gas, and Russia didn't want to lose those markets. So, you know, Russia's capacity to cut off the gas to Ukraine, limited by Russia's desire to continue selling gas to Germany. Russia's solution to this problem has been to try to build pipelines around these unreliable countries. And this way, it would have more influence over everybody, right? And this is how we get, for instance, to the fight over Nord Stream 2. But up until now, all these gas fights have not led anyone to actually be friendlier to Russia. So the attempt gets made, but the effectiveness is limited. Other sorts of economic leverage, you know, Russian companies, Russia is globalized, right? The Russian economy is integrated into the rest of the world economy. And you certainly will hear of Russian firms that are active in European countries and other countries around the world. And they try to push up against regulations, they lobby, and sometimes maybe they lobby on behalf of the Russian government. So is this a way that Russia exerts influence? Possibly, certainly tries to. Again, I'm not sure how much this is really shifting power balances in Europe. I think diplomacy is a really interesting tool of Russian power. It's probably more effective outside of Europe than inside of Europe. But if you look at, for instance, Russia in the Middle East, where it is able to maintain good relations simultaneously with Iran and with Israel, to talk to them, to occasionally, you know, even deconflict a little bit here and there. It doesn't have a very, very high aspirations. I think that's part of the secret to the success of Russian diplomacy in the Middle East. It's not promising all that much. It'll sell some weapons. It'll talk to everybody. And it will engage. There is a perspective for Russia outside of Europe of, we will work with you even if we disagree with you on the things that we can agree to. For some reason, and we can talk about why, I mean, it doesn't work as well in Europe. And, you know, I would argue that the reason why is in part because European countries aren't that comfortable with that sort of setup, with the arrangement of, we agree, you know, we can fight on this side and we can cooperate on this side. We talk about this. We talk about cooperating on climate. We talk about cooperating on counterterrorism. But in the end, these relationships very often tend to fall apart in the face of the competition and the security dilemma of everybody viewing the others infringing on their security. Russia has gotten recently into humanitarian aid and development assistance, still pretty small scale, often in the places where it's fighting wars. Again, hard to differentiate the military tools from non-military tools, but it also, you know, it's taken in a whole lot of refugees from Ukraine, from the war in Ukraine. It provides medical care in Syria. Whether that is a tool of power that actually gets Russia much, I think remains to be seen, but it is something they're experimenting with. I think there's a cautionary tale to be told in all of this from the vaccine diplomacy effort, where there was a lot of fanfare, a lot of very public provision, first of ventilators, then of vaccines that didn't actually end up turning into much of anything. And I think that's, you know, I think that's the challenge, is that they talk a big talk, but some of the stuff never gets there. Now, one of the tools of Russian power that has been getting a lot of attention lately is information and disinformation and propaganda. Most of this is, so none of this is new, though some of the tools used to disseminate it are new. And it includes, you know, so it includes a lot of different things. There's a global information network centered around RT, formerly known as Russia Today, of news agencies, right, that try to deliver Russian perspectives, promote a Russian line. Russia is certainly not the only country in the world that has a national news agency that promotes its line around the world. Arguably, it lies more than some of the others, and arguably its line around the world, its narrative, puts a lot more effort into denigrating what others do and putting them down, rather than playing up what Russia does. But that is what that is. Then some of this is disinformation, right? Some of the material that gets put out this way is quite simply not true. The other bit of disinformation is the social media angle. And, I think we are all at this point, every time you see something odd in your social media feed, you wonder if it's a Russian troll farm behind it. And sometimes it is. This is what I find really interesting about all of this, about the disinformation, about the troll farms, about all of this messaging, is there's lots of it out there. No one has yet demonstrated to me that it works particularly well. And I think there's lots of it out there in part because it's cheap. So there's really not a lot of cost to continuing to support a certain amount of this stuff. There is sometimes lumped together into this is the notion of cyber attacks and cyber activity. And, here I think it is really, in some cases, you get into military type effects and thus military type behavior, but you also get a certain amount of what we might call efforts of political influence, such as you take a hack into a political party or a government server, which is intelligence activity. It may not be savory, it may not be nice, but it's perfectly normal. But then you release it publicly. And there you have an influence operation that is relying on an intelligence hack, and that's a lot more problematical. Why are they doing it? What is its purpose? There's the narrative you hear in the West is they're trying to disrupt our democracies, they're trying to undermine our democracies. Maybe. I'm not sure they think they can do that much damage to our democracies, or at least they didn't before all of the talk about how effective this is. But I would argue that if that's all it takes to disrupt your democracy, something is possibly inherently wrong with the democracy. And then there's kind of the soft power angle, the notion of Russian attraction, some of which is played up by these various tools, some of which is just sort of there. And if you think that Russian culture and Russian pop culture isn't affecting you, you're probably not passing along cat memes. It's everything from the ballet at the high end of culture to cute cats and memes and various random things on the internet. A lot of this comes from Russia. And if you're passing it around, well, it's coming from, some of this was actually used by the disinformation campaigns, right? They started at sites that had cute cats, and then they started passing on information. And some of it just is, right? It's just people developing their websites, developing their storylines. But if you find out that it's Russia, it's, it might change your view about Russia, it might not. The Russian Orthodox Church is often pointed to as a form of Russian soft power. People who speak Russian or have ethnic Russian heritage around the world. Fans of communism who like Russia for historical reasons. Fans of right-wing conservatism who think that Russia represents that worldview today. I would argue they misunderstand the very multi-ethnic and complicated state that actually is Russia, but that exists. There's a Vladimir Putin fan base out there, people who see in him what looks like a strong leader, possibly with a certain demographic that taps into a certain fondness for toxic masculinity, as kind of this vision of what men are like. But you see this. I was once on an airplane reading a book about Putinism, and the Italian gentleman across the aisle wanted to tell me what a big fan he was of Vladimir Putin as a result. I mean, this is a thing. Does it translate into any kind of actual power? And the answer to that is I'm not sure that it does in the way that we tend to try to think about it. I think these are interesting phenomena. They're worth looking at and considering, but I don't know, if you went to the World Cup when in 2018, because Russia made it easy, you may have come away with it thinking Russia's not that bad a place. You know, I enjoyed myself. I had a few good drinks. Is it really going to, if you are a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the United States or a French official, is it going to change your view of what Russia is doing in Ukraine? I doubt it. Maybe I'm wrong. But it's always very difficult to operationalize that sort of soft power. Now, I want to come back to the question of everything is war. Because before I turn to Mike, I want to say that from a Russian perspective, if you read Russian strategic documents, it is all war. Russia is in a struggle with the US-led West, and all of these tools of national power are weapons in that conflict. Because that's how Russia sees it does not mean that that's actually what's going on. But I think that it's important to understand that that is very much a perspective that drives elements of Russian foreign policy making. And I want to close by talking very briefly about Ukraine. I assume we'll come back to Ukraine in the Q&A, because we have so many of these tools of national power concentrated. And the energy lever, which Russia has tried to use against Ukraine, the cultural affinities, which, in Russia, there's a very firm belief that Ukraine is basically Russia, and it's been very difficult to shake that belief. I would argue that up until 2014, that belief had more favor in Ukraine, which has since disappeared in the face of 7 years of war against Russia. Really, one of the best things that ever happened to Ukrainian nationalism, if not to Ukraine, certainly was this war, that it gave Ukraine an identity that was very much not Russian. So that didn't work. Economies that were really closely intertwined, right, completely broken apart by this conflict. Some of it's still there, but not enough to, not enough to shift anything, and you have this very real enmity. And, that's about Ukraine. And now you have war. You've had war for 7 years. You possibly have the risk of resumed large-scale conflict. So, all of these other tools have seemingly failed Russia in Ukraine. It is the military tool that it's turning to there, that it turned to there in 2014, that it's turning to again. And, I suppose that doesn't say much for your other tools of national power. But, as we think from the Western perspective of how to respond, it's a very sobering situation. So I'll close there and turn it over to Mike.
Thank you very much, Olga. Just for the participants, if you have questions, you can please write them down in the discussion box below. And I will give you the floor so that you can ask the question after the three speakers make their presentation. So please don't hesitate to send questions, and you will have a chance to ask them directly to the panelists. So now, Mike, the floor is yours, please.
Okay. Thanks for the invitation to participate. I'll follow up Olga's wonderful remarks. My focus is Russia's a military challenge and sort of Russian hard power and the like. So I'll give a bottom line up front. Outside of NATO, which is an alliance, not a country, Russia has the most powerful single military in Europe by a sizable margin. Moscow does not subscribe generally to how security outcomes are managed in Europe today. There are profound disagreements. We have a set of ongoing conflicts that are not frozen, many of which I personally interpret as a second generation of wars of Soviet succession, that is still Soviet dissolution as a process rather than as an event playing itself out in Europe and other regions of the former Soviet space. Long term, this is not a particularly happy or sustainable situation, because the peace that is generally taken for granted in Europe can be upended at any time in a conflict if it turns into a regional or large-scale war with Russia. That's to say absolutely nothing of the nuclear side of that equation. Most of the arms control, transparency, confidence building arrangements that were meant to improve security and generate stability in Europe are either gone, fraying, or in practice not being implemented. The political context and relationship to renew them doesn't appear to be there. And while there are a lot of really good ideas out there for how to better manage hard security in Europe, from regional, conventional arms control and the like, I don't see the political will to actually implement them amongst the people and actors involved on the political side of this discussion. Now, let me turn to Russian military power specifically. I'm a military analyst, so I'm biased. I think military power really matters, right? It's like the motto that used to be engraved on French cannons, that artillery is the last argument of kings, right? And so to me, use of force remains the most decisive form of argument between states at the end of the day. I think we've grown lackadaisical in assuming that what really matters is economic potential, influence, trade, soft power. Well, first of all, none of that necessarily translates into hard military power. But when it comes to Russia, there are considerable kind of durable asymmetries, and that Russia may historically be a laggard economically, but has always retained a very significant amount of military power. And Russia often has had a fraction of the GDP or economic output of its competitors or opponents, and has also always been relatively backwards technologically compared to rivals. It was often able to sustain prolonged competitions or confrontations and offset some of those big disadvantages with a strong potential for national mobilization and a lot of hard military power, which at the end of the day does matter for quite a bit. So briefly on the Russian military, right? So over the past decade plus, the Russian military has been transformed by a tandem process of military reform. The most significant one started in late 2008, and military modernization. And that has led to the recapitalization of the Russian armed forces after a prolonged period of divestment and disarray post-Soviet dissolution. So the reform of the Russian armed force has led to creating a mostly permanent standing force with advanced conventional weapons, a very robust non-strategic nuclear arsenal, and a modernized strategic nuclear arsenal as well. And that military is increasingly capable of not just fighting local or regional wars on its borders, but also projecting power to adjacent regions and conducting limited expeditionary operations. The Russian military is modernized unevenly, but is steadily improving even in areas that have been traditional blind spots for it. Things like sensors, command and control, joint force integration. I won't go down the military analyst rabbit hole of things that might be particularly interesting to me, but probably boring for others. It is also not a primarily conscript force. That is a misperception. It is actually primarily a contract staff force. The biggest changes in the Russian military have been in force structure, training, competence, and combat experience. The Russian military, on average, has about 250,000 conscripts in it, which is the distinct minority of the force structure. And the Russian military does not have manpower shortages. On the contrary, the manpower base is likely to increase over the coming decade through 2033. From the perspective of economic foundations, Russia spends a bit more than 4% of its GDP on military expenditure per year. That includes the defense budget and many other associated military expenditures, right, that often are not counted in the line item for defense. That is not only sustainable, it's also not especially disproportionate. It's very comparable to what the Russian economy and the GDP actually can afford. It's only disproportionate to European countries, but that's just because they tend to spend so little of their GDP on defense compared to countries like Russia and the U.S. That budget is effectively around $160 billion per year's worth of spending, and it can pay for quite a bit in hard military power. And Russian military expenditure is geared much more towards modernization, procurement, and R&D. That's roughly half of the Russian defense budget. Most European militaries would be lucky if they're getting to a third or a quarter of the defense budget spent on that, okay? Out of total military expenditure, that is about a third, which means Russia spends somewhere on the order of maybe $50 billion on procurement and R&D per year. This helps explain how they're able to buy so much. And that is what's allowed it to recapitalize a lot of the military over the past decade, and it has invested considerably in upgrading its defense industrial capacity. There remain substantial weaknesses there, challenges in serially mass producing advanced weapons and access to specific technologies. You get bottlenecks, you get choke points, but the long story short is there's not an ability to acquire these capabilities, and there's no decline or visible diminishment in either really Russian defense spending or ability to buy advanced weapons or to sustain this force. So this is not a problem that's going to diminish or get a lot easier in the coming decades. I've heard notions like this before, and they're just fundamentally untrue. So, since 2014, the Russian military has been increasingly bloodying this force in a number of conflicts, from Ukraine to Syria, rotating ground units to combat operations in Ukraine, taking most of the senior leadership through Syria. It is an experienced military, unlike China's, where commanders have served in different types of conflicts and done more than one tour, right? Senior Russian military commanders have seen war several times in the last 10, 15 years. What can this military do effectively? It can hold its own and possibly win any local war, hold its own in a regional war against the NATO coalition of states, and can deter with conventional nuclear capability in a large-scale war against the United States and NATO. It may not win, but nonetheless, it can make the costs exceed desired gains, and is also trying to gear itself to be able to project power abroad in a very limited, not scalable, but nonetheless decisive way. Russian military provides hard backing for the pursuit of political aims via non-military means, essentially allowing Russia to engage in coercive diplomacy. And, as I said before, it does represent the last argument, right? In political disagreements, when non-military means fail, Russia does resort to use of conventional military power. And most of the time, from my point of view, whenever Moscow has tried to use force discreetly, it often doesn't work out, and it often escalates into a proper conventional war, where hard military power has to be employed. Now, ultimately, NATO is militarily superior, and that's also a commonly held view in Russia as well, that NATO has quantitative and qualitative superiority kind of writ large, and the United States is a more advanced military power, all right? But war is highly contingent, and the Excel spreadsheets do not actually fight. So taking for granted that NATO would win in a prolonged war with Russia takes a lot to chance and makes a lot of assumptions. Military power needs a context to express itself. So if you ask about how things shake out in a hypothetical conflict, the answer is it all depends, right? The military balance needs a context and a place to express itself. All right. And now I'm going to jarringly turn to the elephant in the room, which is the current situation around Ukraine that I know everybody wants to hear about, and is going to be like a sharp audio track turn in this talk. And I'm going to address it briefly. So the Russian military deployments and buildups around Ukraine. Starting in March, the Russian military began to deploy units out of garrison and task organized battalion and tactical groups on or near Ukraine's borders, in addition to the forces that are permanently based there. Some of those forces, like the ones deployed from the Central Military District, never left the region, stayed there over the summer through the fall, and are still hanging around the area. Since fall and after Zapad 2021 exercise, there have been a series of out-of-cycle Russian military deployments. Many have been much more covert than the spring military activities, less visible. Actually, nobody knows what the size of the buildup is, besides, I think, the intelligence community, but certainly not us here. And this buildup of pre-positioned task organized units as battalion tactical groups is pretty worrisome. And the Russian military very clearly is positioned itself for large-scale military contingency and has been told to do so, and has been doing this from the looks of things all year round. That is, there's not a spring deployment and the fall deployment. This is actually one long year of a series of activities and events. It should not be interpreted as discrete separate activities. Beyond military posture, which is worrisome, disconcerting, it doesn't have innocuous explanations. These are not training activities. They're not qualification checks. These are units, some which are 3,000 kilometers away from their garrisons, okay? And winter's coming, so the fact that they've parked their gear all the way in this area suggests that they're in position for something. There are other indicators as well. I'll give you one sample. Russia this year has invested heavily in the development of a reserve, the BAR system. It's begun a partial call-up of reserves across military districts, okay? Soldiers being formed into territorial battalion groups, which are essentially follow-on forces to hold territory or terrain that is seized. So other parts of Russian military posture increasingly begin to look like an institution that has been told to prepare for a sizable military contingency, where not only will they conduct a large military operation, but one that will involve having follow-on forces that will have to hold some terrain. So On that happy note, I'm going to end my talk and leave it to a Q&A or essentially turn it over to you, Isabelle, so we can hear Sam's comments.
Thank you very much, Mike. Not many good news. I will now give the floor to Samuel, who is going to react to the presentations of both Olga and Michael. Thank you, Samuel.
Thanks to Isabelle for the invitation to FRS and the U.S. mission in France for sponsoring this event. I have both a easier and more challenging mission today, which in the sense that I have no prepared remarks and I'm just reacting to my colleagues, but on the other hand, I have no prepared remarks. So these are going to be a little bit scattered thoughts. I'll start with some reactions to both my colleagues' comments, but which well, I'll give you some reactions to both my colleagues' comments, which both of which I found very interesting as usual. And Olga, Mike, and I are folks who talk about these issues on a regular basis, and I think hopefully we can have an interesting discussion with you all today. So Olga started and ended with the key question about this, whether there is a line between military conflict and the use of non-military confrontational means in Russian thinking, or really in our perhaps analysis of the broader relationship with Russia. I tend to agree with both of her points that they're, these are, as an analytical reality that we should, or as analysts, we should point out that there's a line between these two things, that, things that bullets and tweets are different in different categories, and well, should they be? And also that increasingly Russian strategy and strategists seem to blur this line as a matter of, the way they approach big strategic questions and, Russia's basically modus operandi in the world. But that does leave us with, it raises two questions. One is whether Russia is starting to blur this line deliberately in relations with the West, because that's, I guess, what the impact on the U.S. and Europe is what we're talking about today. And I have in mind some of the coercive gray zone type activities that verge on, they are forceful, but perhaps not involving regular military, some of these assassinations and coup attempts and so on in various places in Europe. Whereas I might have thought that several years ago, maybe pre-2014, that Russia would have sought to maintain that line and avoid any ambiguity in their preference for using political tools vis-a-vis the NATO, particularly. Just, Olga, your thoughts as to whether we're increasingly seeing that line deliberately blurred. And then the question about whether that line exists more so for NATO, whether the reality of Article 5 does affect the Russian calculus and willingness to cross that line, generally speaking. You you had some very interesting comments on Russia's relationships with its neighbors and what it wants in its neighborhood. What was striking to me is I counted 4 different terms for the objective that they're seeking vis-a-vis neighboring countries in terms of their relationships with them: sphere of influence, buffers, friendly states, and client states. And I guess, when thinking about those terms, you could see that they might actually imply quite different things. What I would, at least some of the observations based on some recent work that we did at RAND and just my own thoughts, it does strike me that the bottom line and the desired outcome that Moscow might be pursuing varies quite significantly from country to country. And what it wants, what it will settle for in relations with Uzbekistan is different than what it will settle for in relations with Belarus. I mean, that's obvious, but it does mean that I think we need to maybe just seek a more granular characterization of Russia's objectives vis-a-vis its neighbors, and then getting at the, whether it is in fact a buffer friendly or a client state that they're seeking, and trying to figure out exactly what we mean by those terms. One way of thinking about it is, on the high end of a hierarchical relationship, you have, imperial subordination. Somewhere below that is a fully integrated military alliance and economic union, such as the Eurasian Economic Union. And then below that, in terms of hierarchical relationships, you have maybe non-alignment, that is a country that is neither party to Russia's, Russia-led institutions nor Western ones. And then perhaps at the bottom, one that has fully defected from to the Western Euro-Atlantic institutions. Obviously there are gradations there too, but I think thinking about those kinds of levels of hierarchy might be useful in trying to understand what the bottom line is here, and how it varies from state to state. Russia, your first point about Russia's drivers of the Russia challenge, that Russia's perennial insecurity. So I would just, generally speaking, I agree. The question I guess I would have is how you would think about that in terms of the narrative that the Russians tell themselves about the way the world is changing. That is, that it's becoming a world that is better for Russia over time, that we're going to be in transition to this polycentric world where Russia is one of the centers of power, and although it will be a sort of rough transition, that in the end that will be, and in a way people have interpreted that as sort of feeling of confidence, and there's some evidence to suggest that Russia might feel perhaps more confident than it did before, and so I don't know that I have a concrete question here, but just sort of thinking about how to square some of those points with this perennial insecurity. I think you're absolutely right to point to the diplomatic lever of power as a Russian strength. I would just add two points to that. One, it's just a comparative one. Russian diplomats often are allowed to specialize in a way that ours are not. And I mean, just looking at the very highest levels, some of their current deputy foreign ministers have been in their jobs for over a decade. I mean, and they, and at the lower levels, some of that plays out as well. There obviously are downsides to that. That's why the rotation systems in at least the U.S. Foreign Service was originally created. But the positive sides for Russia, at least, is that they really develop subject matter expertise in a way that gives them a leg up. And the other point I would make is that while I think you're right that the diplomatic tool is more effective in a region like the Middle East, although perhaps others as well, than it is in Europe, you could argue that the cards the diplomats have been dealt are pretty bad in Europe, and despite that, those bad cards, sometimes the outcomes are better than you would have imagined, given the sort of fundamentals of the relationship being so broken. So whether even under adverse circumstances, the diplomatic tool can be of use to Russia. So one thing that neither of you mentioned, it probably fell between the cracks of the hard and soft powers, security cooperation. And that's a US term that includes both arms sales, professional military education, joint exercises, joint development programs in the case of India at least, and other aspects of sort of security interaction with other states. And here, that is a Russian strong point. It is not, of course, in its relations with the West, but Russia's the second largest arms exporter in the world. It does conduct a wide range of bilateral exercises with countries, including India and China. And I think probably, although we don't have numbers on this, is one of the top educators of foreign officers. Russians don't actually publish numbers on a regular basis, only when they're bragging about how many they are, and that happens every few years. So we can only hear, that they're from 46 countries and there are 5,000 of them in 2013, but not anything more comprehensive than that. But nonetheless, it's more than, say, study in Chinese military academies. One more point on the on your last point, which is the what it tells us that given the priority of Ukraine in Russia's foreign policy, the fact that they have had to that none of the tools that you mentioned were enough in the end. And that the use of force has been resorted to multiple times. What that tells us about the failure of Russian foreign policy in the case of Ukraine, and sort of kind of an extreme story in a way. In terms of Mike's comments, I would start out where he started out, which is that the 100% agree with his analysis on where we stand in terms of the arms control and confidence and security building measures in Europe. That is, they're basically almost non-existent at this point. And the irony is that they've never been more needed, right? I mean, since the end of the Cold War, arguably since these agreements were first signed in the very, very end, or even really while the Soviet Union still existed, but the Cold War was over in that brief period between 1989 and 1991 when CFE was signed, for example. So, in the period since then, we've essentially, before 2014, the need to manage confrontation was, kind of, was not as acute as it is now. So we have more need than we've ever had, and yet the mechanisms are more dysfunctional than they've ever been. The challenge is that because the mechanisms were all negotiated in a period when the politics were actually much more congenial, we have no history of negotiating these things in the context of a genuine confrontation, right? All the major agreements were signed and or entered into force in the sort of brief interlude between the Cold War and whatever we're in right now. And so, there is a history of U.S.-Soviet negotiations that led to agreements on major arms control during the height of Cold War confrontation, although during détente, but nonetheless. But even before that, with the hotline and so on. But we don't have that when it comes to multilateral security instruments in Europe. They were all signed in fair weather, and we don't really have a history of negotiating them in bad weather. So that is a challenge going forward. One thing, two other points that, mostly I agreed with what both colleagues said, but including Mike, whether Russian discrete uses of force necessarily always escalate into conventional wars. So a counterexample that came to mind was Libya. There has been limited use of force there that hasn't seemed to escalate into a full-blown conventional war. Granted, it's pretty far away from Russia's borders. But you could also perhaps make the case that since while there have been conventional military battles in the context of the war in the Donbass, a full-blown conventional war so far, big caveat, has been, Russia has managed to actually engage in discrete uses of force that did not escalate beyond the point where they wanted them to escalate. So I guess it's an open question as to whether those discrete uses of force over the course of 7 years or 8 years now almost, will eventually escalate into a major conventional war. But I think that they've demonstrated a significant, impressive degree of discipline about avoiding sort of, about dosing their uses of force, even when so I just wanted to maybe question that assertion there. And then, while I agree that there's one plausible explanation for what's going on right now, that linking it to what happened in the spring that Mike gave for in the Ukraine context, that is, if we assume that the buildup in the spring and the buildup that's going on right now is part of one year-long event, I agree that that is an explanation consistent with the facts. Another one is that the escalation, the buildup in the spring was an attempt to basically achieve part of the same coercive bargaining process that the current buildup is a part of, but it was an attempt to get something, and they were promised certain things, a more active, particularly U.S. involvement in the context of the Minsk negotiations, which we heard about. They got phone calls, but 6 months later, I think it'd be fair to say that they didn't end up further along on their objective. So maybe this is what sort of second round of a coercive bargaining process involving the buildup of significant military capabilities around Ukraine after the first round had failed, and now they're maybe looking for more concrete outcomes than what they got the first time around. I would caveat that by saying, both explanations are consistent with the facts, but we're operating on a lot of unknowns here, so it's important to at least consider alternatives. So with that, I'll hand it over.
Okay. Thank you, Samuel. So now we'll give a few minutes to both Olga and Michael to reply to Sam's comments. And then I will formulate a few of the questions that we have in the discussion box so that you can have an exchange with the audience. So Olga, if you want to go first.
Sure. So thanks so much, Sam. I think really great comments and interesting thoughts, and space for a really meaty conversation on the many terms for what Russia wants in its neighborhood. It always looks bad when you use the same word over and over again. I try to come up with many metaphors and similes, but I also take your point, and I think you are absolutely right that it wants different things in different places, and there's probably a range of what it will settle for in each of those places, right? Some ranges narrower than others. I think there is an interesting disconnect between this notion of I want a buffer and I want to own it, that they kind of want both. I want to have a buffer and own it too. Neutrality isn't quite enough. They'll talk about neutrality, but what they want is compliance. And I think that's actually it's a disconnect in Russian thinking, right? It's not that we don't understand what they want; it's that they vacillate on what they want. But it does, what they can expect of different countries, they know is different. And I think one of the real challenges with Ukraine is their expectations are so out of line with the realities of Ukraine. I think in addition to this being useful, kind of the notion that there are gradations of what they'll accept, in addition to that being useful analytically, it's useful for negotiating purposes, right? If you go in thinking they're not happy with what, say, Western states want, there's an extreme version of what they want. There might be other versions of what they want that could create space for negotiation. Is Russia feeling more confident / less insecure? So I'd say these are two different things, and you can feel more confident and still feel incredibly insecure, and that would be Russia. I think it's feeling that it's doing well, that in many ways, that it is, off its knees, that it is active in the world, that it is at the great power tables, but it still feels that the United States, declining as it may be in all the Russian narratives, just as all the American narratives will tell you that Russia is declining, the Russian narratives want to tell you that the United States is declining, all depends on how you define declining. But bottom line is they're still nervous about it. They still feel insecure. They still feel encroached upon. The world may be becoming multipolar. It may be, Russia may be capable, but they still think that the Americans are bent on regime change and might just eventually get around to them. They still feel that NATO is an alliance that is defined by its enmity towards Russia, and if it gets too close, that's a threat to Russia. And I don't think they're entirely insane to think that. Let's see. Agree with you on Russian diplomats and their specialization. I think the other interesting thing here, which I didn't touch on because it is a kind of at the intersection between the military and the non-military tools, is that in a lot of areas, Russia has these incredibly capable diplomats, but decision-making isn't made at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So they don't get to do these things that they could do, to use their regional knowledge, their understanding of these parts of the world. Very occasionally, the MFA does rely on its expertise. I think in Afghanistan it absolutely does. But on a lot of issues, I'd argue, including Ukraine, it's the presidential administration that drives that train, and it often turns to the military and the security services before it turns to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I don't think this does Russia any favors. I think it's sort of throwing away an excellent tool. Are the Russians better at mil-mil than the rest of us? I think that's a great question, but I would add to it the question of what does mil-mil get you anyway? Right, the whole notion that arms sales translate into alignment, generally speaking, the causal arrow on that goes the other way. Alignment translates into arms sales. Having your soldiers train together or play in the woods together periodically translate into supporting each other on international affairs? I'd say it improves interoperability, right? It improves your capacity to talk to each other, but it's still a case-by-case decision on whether you're going to actually agree on any given issue in international relations. I'm in the school that does not think that mil-mil contacts build alignment. I have not seen the evidence to support that. So I don't see why that would be the case for Russia, and historically it hasn't been any more than for anybody else. Why don't the tools work in Ukraine? And I too think Ukraine it's a special case in part because of the Russian insistence on not understanding it very well. And it's gotten worse, the Russian insistence on not understanding Ukraine, because at this point, it's been 7 years since most Russians in a position to make decisions have talked to Ukrainians who live in Ukraine. You just have less and less an awareness of what things are really like there. And the Ukrainians that Russians do speak to, particularly Russians in positions of authority, are Ukrainians that do like Russia. So they don't have the sense of just how tiny a minority that actually is, and they maintain this view that there is a silent majority in Ukraine that actually loves Russia, even though that has not been the case for a very long time. Let's see. I think most of the other questions were to Mike, though I'll weigh in on one of them, which is that the agreements we have were signed in happy times. They were negotiated, at least negotiations began in really, really tough times, some of them, right, in the 70s, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, between Western states in general for CFE and the Soviet Union. The Helsinki discussion started in a difficult time. The fact that it took so long to get to a deal that things were better by the time they got to a deal and could sign them is not comforting. But the fact that people were willing to kind of come to their senses and say things are really bad, let's sit down and talk, is slightly more comforting. I know Mike already started responding to your questions in the chat, but perhaps he wants to do it on camera.
Michael, do you want to reply to Sam's comment? And also, I guess you have to leave 10 minutes earlier, so I would like to ask you maybe some of the questions which are on in the box. One is about, so sorry, I have to find them. Yeah. How much of what is happening at the border with Ukraine and Belarus is messaging, and how much is reality? That is a plan to use a window of opportunity to strengthen the buffer zone on its western border. And additionally, if this is messaging, who is the interlocutor that the Kremlin is aiming at? Only Biden, as in Europe, who could be a recognized interlocutor? Merkel has de facto left, if anyone at all. And I think it's okay, but you can reply to this and to Sam's comments, and then we will go on with both Olga and Sam with the other questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. So I'll briefly touch on what Sam said. It sounded like we're all generally in agreement. I think on Sam's comment, so I actually see Libya personally as a very interesting corner case because it was a deployment of mercenary battalion tactical groups, but that led to a counter-Turkish deployment on the side of Qatar's coalition. Turkey deployed conventionally with armed drones, and that led to a counter-Russian deployment with tactical aviation advanced air defense operated by Wagner, but directly maintained and supplied by the general staff. So from my point of view, it's kind of like, it is fundamentally a hard conventional escalation resulting from a discrete use of force. It is more discrete than other ones, but we ultimately got to a conventional deployment nonetheless. Just Wagner now being intermixed as a semi-state actor, but with equipment that's maintained and supplied by the Russian military. Now we got to very heavy conventional gear in the conflict nonetheless, by both sides. On Russian deployments around Ukraine, how much is reality? It's all a reality. It's very real. Okay, it's not a drill, it's not a misunderstanding. The question is, how much of this is coercive diplomacy? And it very much is. But what will Russia do if they can't get what they want? If their demands aren't met, if there's not an agreement on Russian red lines, okay, is Moscow going to say, well, we gave it the coercive diplomacy try, now we're going to back off? Or do they actually intend to follow through? I don't know the answer to that, all right? There are probabilistic answers. Anybody who tells you they can read Vladimir Putin's mind is usually trying to sell something. That ain't me. So I don't know what the final answer is. I don't feel like a political decision has been made on the subject, but a decision was made to put preparations and to have them take place over the course of a year to make use of force a viable option. That part at least is clear. So that's all I can say about it. On interlocutors, I mean, who cares? The issue is the substance, not the interlocutor. And it's very clear that Russians in particular want to talk to the United States. The problem has not been interlocutors. So if we spin the Normandy table and we rearrange it so that it's not Germany and France, but it's somebody else there, even the United States at the table, it's a basic question of substance. All right. We are rapidly past the point where the issue is engagement. The first thing I always hear in a conversation is, it's a lack of engagement. We need to have more engagement. No, we need to have substantive engagement. We need to deal with a substance. If nobody's delivering at any part of the substance, the issue is not the engagement. It's not like we're not talking to each other enough. And it's not that there's the wrong person in the room. You know, it's not Merkel will send somebody else, or it's not Macron, somebody else should be there. That is not the issue. We are currently at the point where either there is going to be a political solution or there is not. And I'm increasingly pessimistic about what happens if there is not.
Thank you, Michael. So we'll read some of the questions. So one is about Nord Stream 2 and its divisive impact on the European Union. Another question is why Russia wants to have this discussion on guarantees on no further NATO enlargement right now. Was it in the cards since Putin's essay, National Security Strategy, etc., in July 2021? Or what, in your view, is the best context to read these latest diplomatic and military gestures? Other questions so that you can pick up the ones you want to reply. What is your opinion on Russia's political support for countries with fragile or non-existent democracies, for example, Venezuela, Iran? It's a strategy for its international positioning and more specifically on the energy issues such as Russia's role in OPEC+. What else? What else? What else? I think it's okay for the time being. So who wants to go first? Olga, maybe? Sam?
I mean, I can take a few and then other people can weigh in. I'll also jump in on the who does Russia want to talk to, because I have a slightly different take than Mike. I think they do think that the United States makes the decisions for everybody. So the deal they want is with the Americans. They think the Americans can deliver everybody else. They are wrong, right? I think we all know that that's not quite how it works, but it is very much the Russian perception that if you're talking to somebody who isn't, who doesn't represent President Biden or is not President Biden, you're not going to get the deal that matters. Nord Stream 2, you know, it's interesting. Everybody in the Nord Stream 2 fight claims that they are looking at this economically and pragmatically, and the others are playing politics with pipelines and energy. Everybody is doing both. It is, from Russia's perspective, a way to securely provide energy to Germany without having to worry about political issues with Ukraine. It also conveniently gives you more leverage over Ukraine because, you know, it no longer has this stranglehold over your energy supplies to Germany. From Germany's perspective, it is a great way of making sure you don't have to worry about Ukraine and Russia disagreeing with each other when you're trying to get your energy, which is inconvenient and annoying and potentially keeps you cold in the winter. The argument against it is that somehow Germany should be willing to give up some of its energy security in exchange for some of Ukraine's leverage over Russia. I can understand the German unwillingness to do that. I can also understand other people's desire that Germany do that. Why does Russia want some sort of strange legal guarantee that NATO will no longer enlarge? The Russians have been opposed to NATO enlargement from the start, right? I mean, I used to wake up from dreams in the 90s, which were about NATO enlargement, because there was so much discussion of NATO enlargement in every time you had any interaction with Russians. The legal guarantee idea is actually a little bit odd. Maybe Sam or Mike have a sense of what that would be. I mean, if it's supposed to be a treaty or promise. One of the things they have brought up historically, Austria, Finland. Well, Austria and Finland technically made their own decisions to be neutral. Ukraine had a neutrality clause in its constitution until 2014 and the start of the war. So I think part of the Russia has always wanted both, right? Both these countries say they won't join NATO or the EU for that matter, and NATO and the EU promise that they're not going to take these countries in. The fact that it's very clear that constitutions can change might make you want a little of both, some kind of a treaty, I guess, if it's going to be legally, if what they want is legally binding. But of course, why now? Well, because now is when they've got all these forces sitting next to Ukraine. Now is when they're trying to use their force to back up their coercive diplomacy. Now is when they're making all their asks. So that's why now. As to how this actually is meant to work, though, I have a much harder time with it. Support for autocracies. The Russians support countries, often countries they've had long-term relationships with, that they think supporting them will strengthen their influence, supporting them will demonstrate to other countries that they are reliable partners. And also, if they are at risk of overthrow by what they see as Western-backed coups, because that's not a good precedent. So, I think that kind of explains a lot of this. And in some cases, there are also economic, energy, and strategic interests in play.
I would add one point of information, and then just to get to Katri's question, which I think is a very, very good one, and one I'd be interested to hear Mike's views on too. Ukraine didn't have a neutrality clause in its constitution. It had a law on non-blockness. That was only, by the way, in force from 2010 to 2014. Before 2010, actually since 2002, Ukraine, even under Kuchma, had officially said that it would sought eventual NATO membership without having it codified in the way that it is now codified in the Constitution as a strategic objective. But just to say that I don't know that I do think that there would agree in principle that in an ideal world for Russia, they would want both, the potential aspirants to give up the aspirations and NATO to give up its the potential that they could join. But what they could get in reality is another question. And so I find it I do find it interesting that this is now the talking point. It did just emerge last week, this sort of legally binding security guarantees. It does strike me as a upping the ante, really. But however, it is consistent, of course, with Russian proposals going back to the Medvedev European Security Treaty draft in 2010, right, which was a legally binding document that would have, provided Russia guarantees of, whatever it was seeking there in European security. So, but my concern about this now is, so there were two ways of interpreting this. Either this is what the Russians would call zaprosnaya pozitsiya, right? That it's sort of like an opening position in a bargaining effort where you sort of put out, extreme demands and then you're willing to come down a little bit. Problem is, it's been repeated twice as what we need, according to Putin. So that sort of does create some challenges for him to walk back from that. Anyway, the idea that this is just sort of an opening position that they could be willing to walk down from if in the context of a negotiation is the positive spin. The negative is that this is a really, that they know this is an unreasonable demand, unreasonable in the sense that they're not going to get it. And it's sort of a pretext in a way. But as a, analytically, there's another problem here, which is that even if they were to be granted this, the time frame doesn't fit the decision-making time to either employ the force package that they're preparing or send them home. Like, even if a legal process were to begin now, it wouldn't be, complete for months. And I think, we're looking at a decision time frame for the forces around Ukraine that's not many months, at least. So I'm a little bit, I think we're, at least from a Western perspective, our short-term objective needs to be to have these folks go back to the places where they normally live, right? Not these temporary homes they've created along Ukraine's borders. This kind of discussion on, NATO is not going to manifest itself in time to affect that kind of decision in terms of some concrete outcome, even if it were to be pursued, which it's not going to be pursued. So, that's a problem.
Mike?
Yeah, so I'll just comment briefly here. First, on Ukraine, honestly, we've been here since Yeltsin originally was begging Clinton to promise NATO would not expand to Ukraine. And I actually asked him to make a private promise in any way we could, and certainly that Ukraine would not be one of the early states admitted to NATO. We've been here since the entire idea that NATO enlargement should replace the Partnership for Peace as the main way to go forward. And since those decisions in the early 90s, it's not just the Putin policy. It's been the problem from the very beginning, NATO enlargement from a Russian perspective. Ukraine was one of the states that lies at the heart of it. Okay. Second, it's clear that the Russian red line has evolved. It's not just about formal accession of Ukraine to NATO, which we know is not really in the cards, but it's about NATO presence in Ukraine. What is the extent of Ukrainian defense cooperation with the U.S., UK, how Ukrainian territory is used, what kind of arms are transferred to Ukraine, and the like, right? That's how the position has evolved. And it feels like the demand that they are making, and I think Sam was right, it's an opening position, is really twofold. It's first, not about any further NATO enlargement, but second, it is also about a cessation of a degree of defense cooperation with Ukraine, or how we intend to use or base on Ukrainian territory. And that goes to specific capabilities, missiles, missile defense, and like. It's not about individual tactical weapons, meaning it's not the supplying guns or counter battery radars or javelins to Ukraine. But that's sort of the Russian view, is that is the beginning of a trajectory, and we're clearly on a trajectory from their point of view that they will ultimately find unacceptable. How do we interpret this position? To me, it's hard to say. Here's my view. If the off-ramp is just having substantive talks on this issue, I don't believe it. That is way too easy, and there would have been no problem for Bill Burns or Tony Blinken to say, we'll just add that to the strategic stability talks, and that can be on the agenda. That is not why you deploy this amount of military power over the course of a year. I'm just not buying this at all. And I have a real concern that sometimes here, and I've watched this since 2014, we have off-ramp-itis, like the belief that there is somehow the other side is desperately seeking an off-ramp at all times, and we just need to find very quickly that first exit, and we're going to get off the coercive diplomacy highway to someplace better. And consistently, it turns out that the other side is not looking for an easy off-ramp. They have clear demands or not so clear demands, but either way, they're much more serious about what they're signaling. So I'm worried that we have off-ramp-itis again looking at the situation. I don't think there's easy off-ramps here. I think that the real question is, how can anybody meet the standard that Putin put out just today of judicial legal guarantees? And from whom? The United States can't make guarantees on behalf of NATO. That's 30 countries, right? We just can't. That's just not, the world it just doesn't work that way. We can't make guarantees on behalf of France. Can't be done. France can't make guarantees on behalf of us. NATO, what's NATO supposed to do? Repeal their proclamation at the Bucharest summit at 2008? Is that what they want? They want all of NATO to get together and repeal this? Maybe, I don't know. I'm just being frank. I'm going myself through the options of what they might really want, which might get us somewhere. But the ask being put out by Putin, the way he put it, is not something the US can deliver. And I don't know if something a NATO can deliver. Can NATO make a treaty of this type? I'm skeptical. I'm not a NATO expert. I'm the last person that you should ask about how intra-NATO politics work. But I'm deeply skeptical that NATO can actually give some kind of a legal piece of paper of this like. So I'm very wary of this opening position. All right, these are my thoughts.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm afraid you have to leave us. So thank you very much for your participation. And you can hear the rest of the discussion on the internet in a few days. Thank you. Bye. And so now we'll go for a last bunch of questions. I will try to sum up some of them. One is about the development of Russia's Arctic positions. What can be the impact, I guess, in security terms for all countries interested in this region? We have another question about, this one is intriguing, about Wagner in Africa. And the question was, can it be, is it in fact the strong arm of China in Africa? So I don't know, maybe the implicit question is about cooperation also between Russia and China in Africa. Because the rest of the question is about the strategy of Russia in Ukraine. Could it be that it is a test to see what NATO, the EU, the UN could do in order to evaluate the consequences of an action about Taiwan? So I guess it's more or less a question about the China-Russia cooperation, interaction, and in the global landscape. And another question, but I think that maybe Olga already more or less replied to that, but why has Russia chosen to use military force instead of the gas and energy weapon? So I think you reply more or less, but if you want to add some elements, please feel free to do so. And finally, a question about in the current situation, what kind of progress we can expect from the US-Russia strategic stability discussion, especially from the point of view of European interests, which might be involved in this discussion more or less directly. So maybe Samuel, you want to start, then Olga, and then unfortunately we'll have to say bye-bye. Sam?
Yes, so I guess I'll take the strategic stability question. I'm not sure I understood the Wagner one, and maybe I'll let Olga handle the rest. It was the Arctic, right? Which I shy away from because I don't have much to say about that. I think the first thing to say is that like there will not be a strategic stability dialogue if there's a war in Ukraine, obviously. And it's interesting because clearly, I mean, and this also applies to Nord Stream 2 in a way that I have, given recent experience, I think Russia must know that those things are out the window if they do this. And so the willingness to contemplate it, I think, is striking nonetheless. But that having been said, let's assume that this all ends well. Seems like a big assumption right now that there isn't a war. The strategic stability dialogue is, the farthest they've gotten so far is determining like what the subject matter of the working groups will be. And they're looking both at sort of capabilities of interest to both sides and potential future arms control agreements. I think there's an interesting question here because a lot of the European, what's the most likely pathway to a strategic conflict between the US and Russia? I mean, it's a conventional war in Europe that escalates. The irony is that that is usually not the subject of bilateral discussions. And there's not really a way to channel that above and beyond, the now dead INF Treaty. And the question about both how to handle potential arrangements to minimize the risk of conventional conflict in Europe, let's put it that way, between Russia and NATO, and the future of deployment or non-deployment of INF range ground-based missiles in Europe. It's unclear whether those are germane subjects for the SSD or whether they will be exclusively looking at things, Strategic Stability Dialogue, that's the new acronym, the abbreviation that is, whether those will be germane for the SSD or whether they will sort of fall between the cracks here. So the short answer to Isabelle's questions, I guess it was Isabelle's question or the question that Isabelle raised about where does Europe fit in this, is that it's still unclear. Obviously, the US is coordinating with allies, both before the meetings and briefing them afterwards. But on the sort of core European security issues where there is a US-Russia component, but it's not only a US-Russia component, where they will be negotiated, if anywhere, is an open question. And this is compounded by the totally dysfunctional Russia-NATO relationship, right? Where basically, in terms of representative offices, even there isn't any, there isn't anyone to talk, even if they wanted to, almost. And so that I think poses a challenge because, if we're going to address those issues, presumably it'd be better to do it in a Russia-NATO context, but there is no Russia-NATO dialogue context at the moment. I'll leave it at that.
Olga.
I'll be quick. I thought that was Sam's answer on strategic stability was great. So I'll add nothing to it. On the Arctic, it's really interesting with the Arctic because on the one hand you have, I'm going to have three hands now, because on the one hand, you have actually a decent amount of cooperation and coherent dialogue. On the other, you've got all of this talk of militarization and of people bringing in, establishing facilities and so forth. And then on that third hand, which I seem to have grown, there's the fact that countries' positions and attitudes towards one another on the Arctic don't necessarily reflect their alignments elsewhere, right? Because Arctic countries, everybody wants a claim, and people who are normally quite friendly to the United States get cranky with US activities and so on and so forth. I'm going to combine the Wagner question and the is Ukraine a test question, because I see these both as questions of whether Russia is just doing China's bidding, to which my answer is no. Russia has its own interests in both Africa and very much in Ukraine. That is what is driving these things. Are the Russians and the Chinese talking? Probably. Does the United States potentially see Ukraine as a test for Taiwan? Possibly. But in terms of what's driving Russian policy, I don't think it's Beijing.
Yeah, okay. So we're running out of time, unfortunately. So we really have to close the session now. So I think it was very instructive. Thank you for this dialogue, even though we didn't have the chance to give the floor to the participants. But given the number of questions, I guess it was interesting to them. So I thank you very much for your presentations, for your time and expertise. And I think, again, the US mission in Paris for supporting this event. Thank you, all of you. Thank you to all the participants. Good night. Bye.